What actually makes someone the best visual in K-pop? Is it the shape of a jawline, a number on a fan poll, a title handed down by a company, or a crown that fans place on someone's head themselves? Because here's the strange thing about that word, visual. Every group has one. Every fandom defends theirs, and yet almost nobody agrees on what the title is actually supposed to measure. So when a name like Kim Sok-jin, Jin of BTS, gets attached to a claim as big as best visual of an entire generation, the question isn't really about his face at all. It's about whether that claim can survive contact with the facts. Does it hold up under real scrutiny, under actual numbers, actual history, actual votes cast by actual people around the world? Or is it just something ARMY says because they love him, the kind of claim that feels true from the inside but collapses the moment someone from the outside asks for proof? That is the question this video is going to sit with. Not to tear the title down, not to hand it over blindly either, but to actually look. Because somewhere in Jin's story there's a detail most casual fans don't know. A moment before he was ever worldwide handsome, before Big Hit ever knew his name, when the entire premise of this debate began. And we're going to get there. But first, we need to understand what visual even means inside this industry, and why Jin was given that label in the first place. Kim Sok-jin was born on December 4th, 1992, and grew up between Anyang and Gwacheon in Gyeonggi Province, South Korea. He wasn't a trainee prodigy, he wasn't dreaming of a microphone. He was, by his own account, and by the accounts of the people who found him, walking to school, a student who wanted to become an actor, who later enrolled to study film at Konkuk University. And that's where the story takes its first real turn. Jin wasn't discovered because of a demo tape. He wasn't discovered in a singing competition. He was street cast, essentially because of the way he looked, by a company that at the time was still a fraction of the size it would eventually become. Think about what that means for a second. Before Kim Sok-jin had sung a single note in front of Big Hit Entertainment, before anyone had heard his voice, the company had already made a bet on his face. That's not fan mythology. That's the literal origin story of his role in the group. He entered the industry with almost no formal training in singing or dancing, and the label that eventually stuck to him, visual, was assigned to him before his artistry had a chance to prove itself. That's an uncomfortable starting point for some critics. If the title was given before the talent was tested, doesn't that make visual a kind of consolation label? Something you get instead of being seen as a real artist? That question would follow Jin for years, and we're going to sit with it honestly, because dismissing it would be dishonest. But we're also going to follow where the story actually goes next, because a title that starts as a placeholder doesn't always stay one. BTS debuted on June 13, 2013. 7 members, 1 group, and a role for Jin that the company itself had already decided, vocalist and visual. From day one, he carried both, and almost immediately, a nickname started to form around him in the Korean press and among fans, one that would end up following him for the rest of his career, official enough that BTS itself would use it in international branding, Worldwide Handsome. It's easy to hear a nickname like that and assume it's just fluff, a cute tagline for magazine covers. But nicknames like this don't survive over 10 years by accident. They survive because they get repeated, reinforced, and eventually built into the public record of who someone is understood to be. So here's an open question worth holding on to as we go deeper. Is Worldwide Handsome a genuine industry consensus, or is it something closer to a branding exercise that fans over time mistook for fact? We're going to test that, because what happened over the next decade, the awards, the government honors, the record-breaking solo run, and one specific global vote in 2024 that fans still talk about, is where this debate either falls apart or earns its answer. But this is only the beginning. Let's pause the timeline for a second and ask a more basic question. What does visual actually mean inside K-pop as an industry role? It's not a vague compliment. It's a functional position, almost like a job title. Groups are built with defined roles: main vocalist, main dancer, main rapper, leader, maknae, the youngest member, and visual. The visual is typically the member positioned at the center of promotional materials, the face most likely to appear first in a magazine spread, the one companies lean on to draw in new fans who haven't yet learned to tell the members apart. Which means the visual title, at its core, was never really about art. It was about marketing. It was built for a purpose, to be a door that new fans walk through. And that matters for our central question because it reframes what we're actually debating. We're not really asking, is Jin conventionally attractive? That's a subjective, unanswerable question, and no fact-based video should pretend otherwise. What we can actually examine is something more concrete. Has Jin, over more than a decade, earned recognition, external, verifiable recognition that goes beyond the label the company gave him on day one? That's where the real evidence starts to accumulate. Start with February of 2025, a global voting platform called Mundial, a fan participation site where competitions are decided 100% by public votes cast by users around the world, ran its Visual of the Year competition for 2024. 24 idols entered. Only one could win. Jin won it. Officially, with just under 3 million votes counted in his favor, a number the platform confirmed publicly when it announced the results. He was inducted into the platform's Hall of Fame as a result. Now, here's where accuracy has to win over drama, exactly like we promised at the start of this video. Musique Mundial is not a government body. It's not a music industry authority like the Recording Industry Association. It is, by its own description, a fan voting community, meaning this result tells us something real, but something specific. It tells us that among a global voting population that chose to participate, Jin was the most voted idol for that title in that year. It is a measure of fan enthusiasm and reach, not a scientific measurement of anyone's face. Is that still meaningful? Genuinely, yes. Nearly 3 million people competing against 23 other idols from across the industry is not a small signal, but it's a signal from the fans for the fans. If we're going to claim this proves something to skeptics outside the fandom, we have to be honest that a fan vote alone won't convince them. It proves armies show up. It doesn't on its own settle a generational debate. So what does the evidence look like outside of fan polls? This is where Jin's story stops being just about his face, because for over a decade, most of what elevated his public profile in Korea wasn't cosmetic. It was civic. In 2016, he received a commendation from South Korea's Minister of Culture, Sports and Tourism. In 2017, a presidential commendation followed. Then, in 2018, alongside the rest of BTS, he was awarded the Hwagwon Order of Cultural Merit, 5th class, one of the country's formal honors for individuals who've meaningfully promoted Korean culture on the world stage. In 2021, he was named a special presidential envoy for future generations and culture. In 2020 alone, he was recognized with the Asia Society's Game Changer Award and the James A. Van Fleet Award from the Korea Society, honors tied to cultural diplomacy, not appearance. None of those honors were given for having a symmetrical face. They were given because a government and cultural institutions decided that Kim Sek-jin, as part of BTS, had become someone worth formally recognizing. Here's the tension worth sitting with. None of this actually proves Jin is the best visual. It proves something adjacent, that whatever role he was assigned at 19 years old, by the time he reached his late 20s, he had become something the label visual never fully captured, a cultural figure, which raises an uncomfortable possibility for this video's central question. Maybe the debate about whether Jin is the best visual is asking the wrong question entirely. We'll come back to that, but this is only the beginning of the deeper evidence, because Jin's actual career, away from titles and polls, tells its own story, and it starts with a moment where he had almost no formal training at all. Rewind to those trainee years. Jin has spoken publicly many times about entering the company with barely any musical background. No formal vocal training, no dance history, nothing that resembled the resume of a typical K-pop trainee. He was, by his own account, someone who was found for his appearance and then had to build everything else from scratch, under pressure, in real time, while training alongside members who had been preparing for this life since childhood. That's not a small gap to close. Think about what it actually means to walk into a company as the visual, a role built on how you look, and then spend years quietly rebuilding your entire skill set just to stand level with bandmates who'd been training since they were kids. And he did close it. Not instantly, not without visible struggle, which fans who followed BTS from the early years remember clearly. But over time, Jin's stability as a vocalist became one of his defining traits, the steady, clear tone that anchors BTS's group harmonies, the voice trusted to deliver the emotional high notes in tracks like Epiphany and The Astronaut. He currently holds more than a dozen songwriting credits registered with Korea's Music Copyright Association, meaning he isn't just performing songs, he's helped write them. So here's the picture starting to form. A member who entered the group because of his face and who spent over a decade proving that the face was never the whole story. That's a meaningful narrative on its own, but it still doesn't answer our central question. So let's follow the part of Jin's career that actually put him in direct competition with the rest of the music industry, outside the walls of BTS fandom entirely, his solo career. In October 2022, Jin released The Astronaut, a song he co-wrote with Coldplay. Not featuring Coldplay in some symbolic guest verse sense, co-written with them following an earlier full group collaboration between BTS and Coldplay on My Universe the year before. The results were immediate and they were real. The Astronaut topped the iTunes song charts in over 100 countries and regions around the world. It debuted at number 51 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart, Jin's first ever solo entry on that chart, and at the time, the highest Hot 100 debut for a Korean solo song in years. It launched at number 1 on Billboard's Digital Song Sales chart and World Digital Song Sales chart in its first week. It reached the top 10 of Billboard's Global 200 chart, excluding the US, making Jin the first Korean solo act to do so. In Japan, the single was certified gold by the country's Recording Industry Association. In South Korea, the parent release sold over 1 million copies, earning a million certification on the Circle chart. 24 hours after release, Jin performed the song live for the first time, not in a controlled studio, not in a promotional segment, but on stage with Coldplay themselves during their concert in Buenos Aires, broadcast to thousands of movie theaters across dozens of countries. This is the part worth sitting with. None of those numbers are about how Jin looks. They're chart positions, certifications, sales figures verified by industry bodies in 3 different countries. If the debate about best visual is really a debate about whether Jin has staying power beyond his face, beyond the label the company gave a teenager who hadn't sung a note yet, this is the strongest counter-evidence available. A global act chose to co-write and perform with him. Global charts responded. That's not a fan vote, that's the industry. But this is only part of the story, because right at the peak of that momentum, right as The Astronaut was climbing charts around the world, Jin did something that had nothing to do with music at all. He left, and what happened next reveals a side of this whole debate that almost never gets talked about when people argue about who deserves the word visual. In December of 2022, barely a month after The Astronaut hit its chart peak, Jin walked into a South Korean military facility and became the first member of BTS to begin mandatory national service. Under South Korean law, virtually all able-bodied men are required to serve between 18 and 21 months in the military, typically before the age of 30. There had been years of public debate in Korea over whether BTS, given their scale of cultural influence, might be exempted the way some elite athletes and classical musicians occasionally are. Lawmakers ultimately said no, though they did allow K-pop stars the option to delay service until age 30, a compromise BTS as a group chose not to lean on for long. Jin didn't wait it out. He went first.
Think about the position that put him in. He was, at that exact moment, the most commercially successful he had ever been as a solo artist. Charts were still responding to the Astronaut, and instead of riding that wave, he stepped away from all of it for 18 months to fulfill an obligation that had nothing to do with music, fame, or fan votes. He was discharged on June 12, 2024, becoming the first BTS member to complete his service. And the moment of his return wasn't staged for cameras in the way you might expect from the global celebrity. Witnesses described him as visibly emotional, hugging fellow soldiers at the base in Yenchon before stepping out to greet the small group of bandmates who'd arranged leave to be there. RM greeting him with a saxophone, playing one of BTS's own songs as Jin walked free. Later that day, during a live stream that drew millions of views, Jin told fans in his own words that he had cried during the discharge ceremony itself, and that despite the difficulty, the past year and a half had been meaningful to him. That's not a visual moment. There was no styling, no lighting design, no promotional angle. It was a 28-year-old man crying in a military uniform because a chapter of his life, imposed on him by law rather than choice, had ended. Why does that matter for a video about whether Jin deserves a title built around appearance? Because it's a reminder of something easy to lose in these debates. The people we argue about in comment sections are not brands. They are people who serve in armies, who age, who cry at goodbyes and homecomings just like anyone else. If visual is a title built purely on symmetry and styling, it can't survive contact with a moment like this one. But if it's a title that includes presence, the way someone carries themselves publicly and privately under real pressure, then this moment becomes part of the evidence, not a distraction from it. What happened after his discharge tells us even more. Jin didn't disappear into a quiet post-military transition. Within months, he was named a torchbearer in the 2024 Paris Olympic Torch Relay, a rare honor for any public figure, let alone a musician. He returned to music with the single Super Tuna, then released his first full solo album, Happy, on November 15, 2024, a 6-track project centered on his own reflections on what happiness means to him. In May of 2025, he followed it with a second EP, Echo, continuing to develop the rock-influenced sound he'd first explored on The Astronaut. He also began performing on stages of his own, a solo touring run that took him, among other cities, to London's O2 Arena. The exact scale of those shows, attendance figures, and specific first-ever claims circulating online come from fan tracking accounts rather than official chart or venue data, so we won't repeat unverified numbers here. What we can say with confidence is this. Jin, post-discharge, was headlining his own international shows. A member once street-cast for his face was now selling stages built entirely around his own name. So by this point in the story, here's where we stand. A teenager scouted for his looks, a trainee who had to build his artistry almost from zero, a vocalist trusted with the emotional core of BTS's biggest songs, a solo artist who charted globally alongside Coldplay, a soldier who served without exception, without delay, and a fan-voted Visual of the Year title that nearly 3 million people helped confirm. But we still haven't closed the loop we opened at the very beginning of this video, the one about whether Visual of the Year is even the right frame for what Jin actually represents. That answer is coming, and it's more complicated and more human than a single title can hold.
Now let's be fair to the other side of this debate, because a script that only stacks up wins isn't credible, and credibility is the entire point of asking this question in the first place.
Some critics, both inside and outside K-pop fandoms, push back on titles like Best Visual of a Generation for a simple reason. They argue attractiveness is inherently subjective, shaped by culture, personal taste, and even algorithm-driven exposure on social media. A fan-voted platform, they'd point out, measures who has the most mobilized, most online, most emotionally invested fan base, not who is, in any objective sense, the most visually striking idol working today. By that logic, Music Mundial's result tells us BTS's fandom is large and devoted. It doesn't settle an aesthetic argument that by nature may not be settleable at all. There's also a fair critique buried inside K-pop culture itself. The visual position exists in nearly every group, which means dozens of idols across the industry carry some version of this title at any given time. If everyone's group has a visual, the word starts to lose its power to distinguish anyone uniquely as the best. Critics who raise this point aren't attacking Jin personally. They're questioning whether the entire premise of ranking visuals across an industry this large was ever a meaningful exercise to begin with. Those are legitimate points, presented honestly, not dismissed, and they deserve to sit right alongside everything we've covered so far, because a fair answer to this video's title has to hold both sides at once. But here's what tips the scale, at least in the eyes of many industry observers and fans who follow Jin's specific journey rather than the abstract concept of visual as a category: longevity. K-pop is an industry that moves fast. Trends shift. New groups debut every year, each with their own visual, each temporarily flooding the same conversation. Very few idols hold a nickname like Worldwide Handsome for over 10 years, still hear it used seriously by press and fans alike, and still win global fan votes for it more than 12 years after debut. That kind of staying power is rare enough that it starts to look less like a marketing accident and more like something closer to consensus, even if that consensus was built one fan vote, one magazine cover, one award ceremony at a time. Which brings us to the moment that, more than any chart position or government honor, actually answers what this title has always been about underneath the surface. Go back to that discharge day in June of 2024. Jin, standing in uniform, hugging soldiers he'd served alongside for 18 months, men who had no reason to know or care who Worldwide Handsome was, because to them he wasn't a visual, he was just a fellow soldier finishing his service. And when he turned to face the small crowd of bandmates and fans waiting outside that base, the emotion on his face wasn't performed. It was the same face that's been called the visual of a generation, but in that moment, stripped of styling, stripped of choreography, stripped of everything except a person who had just finished something difficult and was allowed, finally, to feel it. That's the open loop this entire video has been circling since the very first question. Is Jin the best visual of his generation because of symmetry, lighting, and magazine covers? Or is it because, over more than a decade, in moments with cameras and moments without them, the same warmth kept showing up, on award stages, in military uniforms, in solo performances shared with one of the biggest rock bands on earth, and audiences, again and again, chose to keep watching? The evidence doesn't hand us a clean, universal verdict. It never could, not for a claim this subjective, but it does something better. It shows us a career sturdy enough to survive the scrutiny this video promised at the start, and that, on its own, is rare.